Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center. I'm Robert Newman. I'm the president and director of the center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our last public lecture of 2016. Yes. I first met Joan Hinde Stewart in 1999 when I was chair of the English department at the University of South Carolina, and she had just been hired as the new dean of liberal arts. Joan and I scheduled a lunch together, and I drove her to a new restaurant in Columbia named, as I recall, Amadeus, which featured Nouveau German cuisine, whatever that is. I vaguely remember that it had this ornate red satin interior with plush red chairs, and sprinkled throughout the restaurant were statuettes of Mozart. And all along the walls were these Asian-style silk screens of monkeys. Now, I had been there once before, and I thought the food was pretty good for Columbia, but I hadn't really fully taken in the decor. So I was wondering to myself, why had I taken my new boss, who I was just meeting, to this strange simian Asian homage to a boy genius that featured desserts with an overabundance of whipped cream. And I imagined that Joan was thinking the same thing, but she professionally restrained her comments to very benign statements like, interesting. However, she only required a single irreverent prompt from me to launch into a series of wry comments that I delighted in encouraging, and there our friendship and partnership was born. Shortly after assuming her decanal duties, Joan began doing what none of her predecessors had done, but what now has become the standard obligation of most deans throughout the country, fundraising. And I remember one of her initial forays when she invited me to join her at a dinner at the faculty club that she was hosting for a prospective donor to the college, a very wealthy man who considered himself a poet, an avocation testified to by his Vanity Press published collection of maudlin rhymes. And during the course of the dinner, which was going quite well, Joan began reciting from memory some of his poetry to him. And I thought to myself, what a force this woman is, and to what extent she's willing to subject herself for the ultimate benefit of the college. And over the next year, I observed closely her diplomatic skills, her sound judgment, her ability to clearly prioritize and to implement those priorities, her willingness to make difficult choices despite the prevailing politics, if they were the right choices, her demand for precision in thought and in language, and the respect and the trust that she deservedly earned across the campus. During the following year, when in part motivated by my observations of Joan, I decided to throw my hat in for a dean position elsewhere, Joan and I went out for drinks before my campus interview, during which Joan grilled me relentlessly and then announced, "You're ready." That unwavering and helpful support and mentorship for me and for countless others has always been there. It's a mark of leadership and professionalism, as well as of kindness and generosity. Last May, I attended the retirement party in New York City for Joan after her 13 years as president of Hamilton College. I knew of many of her accomplishments during that long and productive tenure. Her fundraising prowess had become legendary. The number of new buildings, a veritable campus renovation. The prestige of the faculty she had recruited had been significantly enhanced. The quality and success of the students had moved into the upper echelons of liberal arts colleges. And by every ranking and metric, Hamilton had become a leading national institution as a result of Joan's stewardship. And her husband, Philip, had continued after his retirement at Duke as a renowned scholar in French literature, while also becoming the college's first gentleman and first cook. But what I had not anticipated from the board, from the donors, the administrators, the faculty, the staff, and the students, all who honored her that night in compelling and heartfelt story after story, was the pervasive warmth and the palpable love and admiration they felt for her. How much they clearly enjoyed and indeed delighted in working with her, not just as a president, but as a really smart, witty, compassionate, and genuine person who had great taste in shoes. And this is not only because Joan had the good luck to preside over a college named for a founding father whose life was now being celebrated and a hip-hop smash on Broadway. Indeed, Joan launched into her own rap song that night that I urge you to request tonight as an encore. Any academic administrator does not lead an institution successfully for 13 years without making bold decisions and navigating through the Scylla Charybdis of challenge and resistance. Yet Joan seemed to have taken the entire college to new heights and still preserved boundless, enthusiastic, and universal support. And at the end of the evening, the board announced a $5 million scholarship endowment had been raised in her name, a true testimony to the perpetuity of her influence. Even during her demanding administrative career, Joan has always been an accomplished scholar of 18th century French literature, especially women writers like Colette, Marie Riccoboni, and Isabelle de Charrière. In addition to several well-received books and articles, she's received numerous fellowships, honors, and awards for her work. And in 1982-1983, she graced our center as a fellow while a young scholar from North Carolina State. This early experience cemented her long-term support for the center so that she agreed to join our board last year. And the trustees were so instantly impressed with and enthused by her that we've made her chair of the Scholarly Program Committee, which oversees the core of our mission. Indeed, we're delighted she has joined us this year as a resident associate, working on a project that's long been germinating, comparing two of the most remarkable women in French history, the Maid and the Milkmaid, Joan of Arc and Marie Antoinette. I trust the inspiration she has received from her namesake tonight will also in turn inspire you with momentous visions. I give you the Maid from New York, wielding her always astute scholarly sword. Please welcome Dr. Joan Stewart.
What an extraordinarily generous introduction that was. I'd like to say something humorous about it, but I can't think of anything because I'm so moved. Instead, I will say how fortunate I believe this center is to have someone of the discernment and wit and effectiveness of Robert Newman leading us. I am really, really privileged to work with him. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight to hear me talk a little bit about Joan of Arc. In 1904, Mark Twain published an essay in which he called Joan of Arc the most extraordinary person the human race has ever produced. Now, we think of Twain, of course, as a satirist, as someone who liked to poke fun. But I'm telling you, he poked no fun at Joan of Arc. There is no ironic distance here. When Mark Twain published that essay about 6 years before his death, he was positively besotted with the Maid of Orleans and entirely serious in calling her not just extraordinary, but also the wonder of the ages. Those are big claims, but hyperbole aside, Joan of Arc really was pretty remarkable. And I share Twain's sense of wonder and fascination. What I'd like to do tonight is to give you some sense of why, and also perhaps some insights into the ways in which her image has remained so persistent over the centuries, nearly 600 years since she died. I do not propose to treat her as an historian would. I intend rather to talk about her as symbol, icon, and inspiration. And I want to begin with two quick anecdotes. The first one took place on the campus of Hamilton College about 4 years ago. I'd been asked to give a talk to my colleagues in the library. And as I walked over there thinking library thoughts, I suddenly had a memory of something that had happened many, many years ago, many, many years before, and which I hadn't thought about in many years. And it was the memory of the first book I ever checked out of a library. The library in question was the High Lawn branch of the Brooklyn Public at West 6th Street and Kings Highway, 6 long blocks from the apartment where my family lived. And the book in question, can you guess, was a biography of Joan of Arc. Now, obviously, my childhood interest in Joan had to do primarily with the fact that I was her namesake, but I think now also it may have had to do with the fact that she was a relatively newly minted saint, having been canonized only a few decades earlier. In any event, I got home with the book, and I opened it, and I realized to my horror that it did not have the imprimatur of the Catholic Church, which is, of course, official approval of the Church of any book on a religious topic. It had been drilled into us in catechism classes at St. Mary's that we must never read anything about doctrine that didn't have the Church's seal of approval. Did this apply to Lives of the Saints? Would I risk my soul if I read the book? Well, I read it, come what may. I was in the library at this point, as I said, and that sudden memory of Joan inspired me to do a little bit of research. And I discovered that 2012 was the 600th anniversary of her birth. Well, we think it was the 600th anniversary. We don't really know for sure when she was born. She didn't know either. But there is the likelihood is she was born in 1412. And there's even a tradition that she was born on the Feast of the Epiphany, which would have been January 6th, 1412. My interest in Joan was rekindled, and like Mark Twain in his 60s, I became positively besotted with the Maid of Orleans. I could do nothing but think about Joan. That's the way she is. She grabs you, and no matter how well you know the story, you keep hoping, I still keep hoping, that it will turn out differently. The second incident took place the following summer. My husband Philip and I were in France, and we were traveling through the southwest of France with some French friends when we stopped for lunch. There were 7 of us at a country restaurant. My French friends had all just been reading a biography of Marie Antoinette, and they were talking about it. So our chatty waitress arrives at the table, and she announces that she, too, has been reading a biography. Oh, really? And what is that? Well, it's a biography of Joan of Arc. And she proceeds to inform us that Joan of Arc was actually the illegitimate daughter of the Queen of France, and therefore half-sister to the future king. I gulped. But it got worse, because one of my otherwise well-informed French friends nodded his agreement, and he added that Joan of Arc had not been burned at the stake. She had gotten away at the last minute, moved to a neighboring village, got married, settled down, and raised a family. What became clear to me at that point is that as familiar a name as is that of Joan of Arc, as a historical figure, she is really not very well known. Okay, so if Joan was not the Queen's love child, who was she? To answer that question, let's go back to the late 40s, about the time I was checking that book out of the High Lawn branch of the Brooklyn Public Library. My husband has told me about a memory of his. He remembered as a boy seeing an issue of Life magazine with a full-page reproduction or picture of Joan of Arc at the stake. I did a little research on this, and sure enough, the issue in question dates from November of 1948, and there it is. You see on the left the cover, and on the right you see a picture of a magnificent Ingrid Bergman in the role of Joan of Arc. That issue was published to mark the release of a film by Victor Fleming, a film for which In fact, Ingrid Bergman got a Best Actress nomination. It's really a terrific film, released in 1948. The problem, however, was that about the time that the film opened in theaters, news arrived that Bergman was having an affair with Roberto Rossellini, and this led to a bit of a kerfuffle with the Catholic Church, which did not feel good about a saint being played by an adulteress. So the film had less success than it might otherwise have had. One other thing about that film, Jose Ferrer made his screen debut in it. He played the pusillanimous King Charles VII to Ingrid Bergman's luminous Joan of Arc. In any event, the article in Life, of which you see the images there, begins with a synopsis, and I'd like to read you that synopsis. Here's what it says. Joan of Arc was a country girl from Lorraine who in February 1429 put on men's clothing, grasped a sword, and rode briskly onto the stage of history. She didn't know A from B, she said at her trial, but she had heard voices of saints telling her to save France. In one extraordinary year, she commanded the French armies, crowned the French king, and made the French live again. Then she was betrayed by the enemy, declared a heretic by a church court, and burned by the English in Rouen. It's really not a bad summary, although the French armies is a bit of an oversimplification. But to tell you the truth, a lot of nonsense has been written and believed about Joan of Arc. Witness that lunch I had in Périgord in France when I heard these incredible myths, two myths, the bastardy myth that she was the daughter of royalty and the escape myth that she wasn't burned at all, two myths that have been repeatedly proven groundless. They were invented in the 19th century. There's no truth in them at all, and yet they live on. But Life, in those 4 short sentences, got it pretty much right. So I'd like to flesh out that story a little bit. And I'll begin by saying just a word about the incredibly complicated geopolitical situation into which Joan was born. The early 15th century in France was a time of civil war, intolerance, pestilence, and social and political upheaval. Does it differ much from the 17th or the 20th? Maybe not. But what I can tell you is that the mortality rate at this point was so high that in parts of France, the population was probably about half of what it had been in the previous century. I've just said France. But in fact, France was not yet a unified modern nation. Large portions had been occupied by the English for about 75 years in a dynastic conflict that we call the 100 Years' War. What was at issue, fundamentally, was who should sit on the French throne. And because of various intermarriages and treaties, the English had good reason to think that the throne should be theirs, and they were determined to make it so. In the early to mid-15th century, the struggle was basically between the supporters of the uncrowned French king, Charles VII, who was also called the Dauphin, and the English child king, Henry VI. The English, I should add, were generally in league with the Burgundians. The political situation was unimaginably complex. Different parts of the country were under the control of different groups. I have a map here of what the nation might have looked like in the time of Joan of Arc. And you can see that the north is more or less under the control of the English and the Burgundians. The English have the red part, the Burgundians have the green part, while the south is more or less under the control of the native French. What's for absolute sure at this point is that things were not going well for the French. This is when an illiterate peasant erupted into history. Joan was born in the village of Domremy in the eastern part of France in the province of Lorraine, or Lorraine. This was a village that was loyal to the French king, Charles VII, but which was surrounded by Anglo-Burgundian-controlled territories. All right, so I'm working this little pointer. Is it working? No, not yet. I'm going to point to it. There it is. Is it good? So there it is. That's Domremy, where she was born. And you can see that she is right in the middle of English and Burgundian-controlled territories. So her village was subjected to a great many raids. There was a lot of pillaging. There was a lot of slaughtering. Cattle were slaughtered. Foreign armies were marching through. Joan saw a lot of suffering and killing in her young years. She was the fifth and youngest child of a comfortable peasant family, and she was deeply religious. What she especially loved were the bells that were rung in the village church across from her home. Shaw has written a wonderful play called St. Joan. It's full of terrific lines. Here's one line. A French prelate says to the heroine in Shaw's play, "Child, you are in love with religion." It's not far off. Joan's house, by the way, still stands, as does the church. Well, at the age of about 13, as Joan knelt on one summer day at noon for the Angelus, she heard voices. And those voices would later be identified as those of two archangels, Saints Michael and Gabriel, and two virgin martyrs, Saints Catherine and Margaret. The voices would later be accompanied by visions, and they would continue speaking and appearing to her for many years. They were quite specific. They directed her to save the nation. They told her that it was incumbent upon her to boot the English out of France, as she put it, and to get the king, Charles VII, officially crowned in the great French cathedral of Reims, where for hundreds of years the French had always crowned their kings. Charles, at this point, was holed up in the Loire Valley since Paris was under control of the English. And so at the age of about 17, Joan finally decides to act on these messages and to leave her village. This, mind you, is a girl who cannot read or write, who has never mounted a horse, and who has been outside of the village only a very few times. But she's determined. She defies her parents. She sets off with an older male cousin, and she has decided that she's going to make her way to the king, and she's going to reveal and undertake her mission. Her first stop was the neighboring town of Vaucouleurs, which is right there, just to the north of Domremy. And she stops there because she needs the help of the captain of the royal garrison. She's going to need his help in getting to the court. His name is Robert de Baudricourt. He's a tough and skeptical man. And his first reaction is to say to the cousin, "You need to box her ears and take her home." But Joan's persuasiveness is matched by her persistence. And within a short time, Baudricourt relents, and he provides her with an escort to get to court. It took them 11 days to reach the court, riding mostly at night for fear of the English and the Burgundians, but stopping whenever they could, at Joan's insistence, to hear Mass. She put the trip to good use, gaining some of the experience she so sorely needed, experience about horses, men, geography, warfare. Clothes were to play a crucial role in the story of Joan of Arc, and I'm going to come back to that. What I want to say now is that before setting out, she shed the red woolen dress in which she had left home, and she put on men's clothes instead. And she cut her hair short. And when I say short, I mean short. She cut her hair in the round bowl cut that was popular for boys and young men of the day. And this haircut was above the ears. It was not a flattering cut. But anyway, that's what she did. And it was thus that she appeared in men's clothing with her bowl cut before a stupefied king. But Charles's situation was pretty desperate. He needed a savior. And before long, he came around too. He arranged to have Joan questioned. He had her virginity confirmed. He made her a suit of armor, and he sent her off with troops to Orléans. Why Orléans? Orléans is, as you see, it's situated on the great river Loire, and it's more or less on the border between the English-controlled territories and the French-controlled territories. So it's a pivotal town of great strategic importance. And for 7 months, Orléans had been under siege by the English. The inhabitants were getting pretty desperate. So Joan, with daunting self-confidence, based on no experience at all, tells the king that she will go indeed to Orléans and that within a very short time, he will have an unmistakable sign that she was sent by God. What would the sign be? Obviously, it would be a French victory, because that's how God worked in those days. He gave the victory to the people whom he favored. Sure enough, 9 days after she gets to Orléans, the siege is lifted, the English leave, and the world begins talking about the Maid of Orléans, La Pucelle d'Orléans. This is the name that was given to her at this point. Pucelle in the sense of maid, maiden, girl, virgin. It was also the name that Joan herself used. And from then on, when she dictated letters, she sent a lot of letters to the English captains telling them they better get out or she was going to kill them all. I mean, she was quite determined. Anyway, she had all those letters signed, La Pucelle, Jeanne La Pucelle. With her astonishing success at Orléans, La Pucelle captured the attention of the English, as you can imagine. She boosted the morale of the French, and she breathed courage into the vacillating and frightened Dauphin Charles. She had a few more military victories, and then she led him to Reims for the long-awaited coronation. But Joan's luck soon changed, and she and her troops were repulsed at Paris. In fact, she was wounded fairly gravely at Paris. The king, meanwhile, had begun thinking that maybe he didn't need to be fighting, maybe there was a political solution to the troubles of the realm. Joan, however, was committed heart and soul to the fight, and with some troops, she proceeded to attack Compiègne, a city about 60 kilometers to the north of Paris. There it is. The city was held by the Burgundians. During the battle, an enemy soldier grabbed the tail of Joan's cloak and pulled her from her horse. Her cloak, you say? What was she doing with a cloak? Well, it turns out that despite the masculine dress, Joan had developed a taste for finery, and she'd taken to wearing beautiful cloaks of gold and ermine over her armor. Bad idea. So she's pulled from her horse, she's captured by the Burgundians, and she is sold in a while. It takes them weeks or months to get this sale settled to the English. They sold her for 10,000 pounds, which was a very, very high price for a prisoner in those days. Her brief military career was over, and she would spend the rest of her short life in captivity. She was 18. Her trial began about 8 months later and has produced one of the most compelling historical documents ever to come down to us. The trial took place in Rouen, which was a city controlled by the English and where there was a very strong English military presence. It lasted for nearly 5 months, culminating in Joan's execution. What makes the trial very hard to understand today is that it was politically motivated, but it was carried out in a church court according to inquisitorial procedure. So politics and religion are inextricably intertwined in everything that went on in that trial. The English wanted to discredit La Pucelle. They wanted to prove that God was not on the side of the French, and that therefore any victories the French had were actually the work of the devil. I'm going to go back to Shaw once more. He also has another wonderful line in St. Joan. He has the English chaplain sniff. We were not fairly beaten. No Englishman is ever fairly beaten. And so Joan's judges set out to prove that she had committed a crime or crimes against Christianity, and the main crime was heresy. The chief judge was a careerist bishop. He was named Pierre Cochon. He was French. No, wait a minute. He was French, but he had long sided with the English. And his name, as I think some of you have already noted, Cochon, C-A-U-C-H-O-N, is very close in sound to cochon, C-O-C-H-O-N, which means pig. So Cochon, the pig, has provided a lot of fodder for commentators over the years. Also present at the trial were a deputy inquisitor, a prosecutor, notaries, clerks, and over 100 expert advisors or assessors. And these people included bishops, abbots, priests, Benedictines, Franciscans, Dominicans, scholars of canon law, theologians, doctors of the church. They were all there. As for Joan, she was probably the youngest person in the room, and she was, without a doubt, the only woman. She was shackled to a bench during the proceedings. She had no counselor, no advisor, no protector, no friend, no family member, no one to encourage or support or advise her. The Inquisition, it's fair to say, was not particularly concerned with the rights of the accused. No witnesses were called on Joan's behalf. She was not only shackled during the trial, she was chained to her bed at night. So she was also sleep deprived, and she was occasionally ill. In fact, once she developed a case of gastroenteritis so severe that they were really worried it would kill her before they could get her convicted. Reading the transcript of that trial today, one is struck by the way the pretexts for a politically motivated trial are foisted off on God. And one is struck, too, by the almost Kafkaesque horror in Joan's miseries and interrogations. And yet, as unfair as it all seems to a 21st century reader, Cochon and company were acting, for the most part, according to the norms of their time. So what exactly was Joan charged with? Well, initially there were 70 overlapping accusations. They included blasphemy, deceit, disobedience, divination, presumptuousness, rebellion, sedition. She consorted with demons and evil spirits. She carried a mandrake, which is a plant used in magic. She practiced sorcery. She'd been a prostitute. She defied the English and Mother Church. These were eventually distilled to 12 articles of accusation. And those 12 articles center essentially on two things: scandal and heresy. Scandal, in that she cut her womanly, God-given hair, dressed like a man, rode a horse, went to war. And heresy in that she refused to throw herself on the mercy of Mother Church. Heresy, by the way, in this day was an expandable category. It wasn't like theft or murder or adultery, which are fairly well defined. Anything, heresy was really great because anything could fit in under it. So Joan was accused of heresy. It seems now, when we read the transcript, that in the minds of her judges, Joan's fundamental sin was to be so conceited as to think she could do without the church. Her response was essentially this: how could the church judge her when her mission came directly to God? And it was to God to whom she would answer. It was God to whom she would answer. So, the trial was held in the mornings in the Chateau of Rouen, and the proceedings were conducted, of course, in French. A couple of notaries took notes, handwritten notes on what they heard. Maybe they dozed off now and then, I don't know, but they took notes. That evening after dinner, the notaries would meet in the home of Cochon, and they'd compare their notes, and they'd collate them. And if they disagreed on what they heard, they'd reach some kind of compromise. And in this way, they produced the transcript. Sometimes hours of repetitive questions and testimony were collapsed by the notaries into just a few lines or a few sentences. Shortly after the trial was over, the whole thing was translated from French into Latin, the official language of the church, and very little of the original French transcript was preserved. So what came down to us were copies of the Latin transcript. Cochon had several copies of it made. He was very proud of the care with which he had carried out this trial. Obviously, this is no verbatim record, as you'll sometimes read. You sometimes read that we have a verbatim record of the trial. We don't. And yet, astonishingly, Joan's voice is there. I want to quote one of her biographers, Marina Warner, who writes this: "The transcript gives us the voice of this young woman across the centuries with almost unbearable immediacy. Her spirit leaps from the page, uncompromising in its frankness, good sense, and courage." The examiners tried to wear Joan down with repetitive questions or to confuse her by jumping from one subject to another. Despite her fatigue and her shackles, she defended herself. She refused repeatedly to swear to tell the whole truth because, she said, certain matters were between her and her saints or between her and her king. She often told them no, she wouldn't answer a question because it was extraneous. Or, and this is one I like best, she'd say, "I already answered that, just reread your notes." There is a very famous example of her mental vigor and the subtlety with which she sometimes responded. She was asked, "Do you know if you are in the grace of God?" Now, this was a trick question because the church held that no one could be sure of being in the grace of God, and to say you were would be unforgivable presumptuousness. On the other hand, if you said you weren't, this would be tantamount to admitting that you were in a state of sin. How did Joan answer? She said, "If I am not in the grace of God, may he put me there, and if I am, may he keep me there." It is wonderful. And she avoided the trap, and according to one observer, the court was stupefied. I want to give you a few other of her answers that I particularly love. She was asked, "Does God love the English?" Well, you can see what a trick question that was. God does God. Here's what she answered: "Of course he does, but in England." She was asked why she was acting like a man, riding around with men instead of staying home and doing a woman's chores, and she answered, "There are enough other women to do them." She was asked if St. Michael was naked when he appeared to her, and she replied, "Do you not think that God has the means to clothe him?" She was asked whether St. Margaret spoke English, and she said, "Why would she speak English when she's not on the side of the English?" So, as you might gather from the last two examples I gave about Margaret and Michael, the examiners were especially interested in the voices that Joan had been hearing for all those years. Those voices have, of course, raised vexing questions, and they've spawned various attempts at explanation. A recent study by two Italian medical researchers diagnoses Joan as having a form of epilepsy. It's a form of epilepsy that affects the part of the brain responsible for hearing. Maybe. But I think what they're forgetting is that people heard voices in the Middle Ages. Joan was by no means the first young woman to have a direct revelation from heaven. And her judges were not particularly surprised that she heard voices. They didn't particularly doubt that she heard voices. Their question was, where did the voices come from? Did they come from God or from the devil? That was what they needed to know. A second thing of major interest to her judges was her clothing. Why did she persist in wearing men's clothing? Who directed her to do it? Didn't she realize that wearing men's clothing was a sin against God and nature and society? Well, several recent books and articles suggest that Joan may have been bisexual or transsexual, as evidenced by the wearing of men's clothing. And I suppose that's possible, but I think it's also useful to consider that if Joan was going to ride and fight with men and sleep beside them in the fields at night as the only woman, she would really not be well served by skirts. So anyway, with relentless questioning about the voices and the clothes, the trial wore on. In mid-May, she was threatened with torture. You will sometimes read, too, that Joan of Arc was tortured. She was not, unless you consider all the whole trial torture and the shackles and the chains, but she was not tortured in the torture chamber. They dragged her off there and they showed her the instruments, and they told her that unless she abjured, she would be tortured. And she responded, "Go ahead, torture me, and I'll say anything you want, but afterwards I'll say that you made me say it." They took a vote and decided against it. Joan remained resolute until almost the very end. And at the very end, she was dragged off to the cemetery. And in the cemetery, a stake had been erected. An executioner had been there, had come, and there were throngs of people. And at this point, she was frightened, and she gave in. and she signed the abjuration that they had wanted her to sign, throwing herself on the mercy of the church. She signed it with an X. She was returned to her cell, she was reclothed as a woman, and her head was ritually shaved in order that her hair could grow back the way a woman should. 4 days later, the jailers arrive in her cell, and lo and behold, she's put the male clothing back on. Now, this is an interesting question. Where did she get the male clothing that she's put back on? I mean, she's chained to her bed. I can't imagine she has a large wardrobe in this dungeon. So some historians speculate, and I myself incline to believe this, that during the night the jailers removed the woman's clothing, leaving Joan no choice but to put on the men's clothing when she got up. Whether that happened or not, we really can't be sure, but what we do know is that she took full responsibility for her change of clothing. And moreover, she said that her saints had come back to her and reproached her for having betrayed them. "You have damned your soul," they told her, "in order to save your life." Well, between a resumption of the male clothing and the declaration that the saints had returned, Joan's fate was sealed. She knew it would be. She had clearly decided that death was preferable to life in a fetid English prison, where she would be chained and threatened by English soldiers with impunity. She was condemned as a relapsed heretic, and she was immediately handed over to the secular authorities for burning. On her head was placed a mitre, and the mitre bore 4 words: relapsed, heretic, apostate, idolater. Soldiers escorted her to the place of execution, which was the old marketplace in Rouen. Normally, for a burning, a stake would be erected on the ground. But thousands of people had come to see Joan burned. And for their viewing convenience, a high platform was erected. The result of which was that the executioner couldn't reach Joan in order to accord her the usual mercy of a quick death by strangulation. Joan was burned alive on May 30th, 1431, at the age of 19 and a half. The English wanted no relics, so her ashes were thrown into the River Seine. And so it ended. But not really, because there was a new trial 25 years later. You see, in that quarter century after her death, the political situation had shifted. The English were now pretty much gone from France, and the native French were in the ascendancy, and they were very grateful to Joan for her role in turning the tide of the war. So they reopened the trial. This time, they called witnesses, family, friends, soldiers who had fought with her, even some of the participants in the first trial. And they decided that the original charges were false, that the trial was null. It was nullified, and the record of that trial, one of the Latin transcripts, was ceremonially burned. The records of those 2 amazing trials have come down to us. They've been preserved for over half a millennium. And because of those records, I can confidently assert, as I did at the outset, that Joan of Arc was not the illegitimate daughter of royalty, and that she was burned at the stake. She would be beatified in 1909 and canonized in 1920, 500 years after her death. By the time of that horrible death, after a public career of just 2.5 years, La Pucelle was an international celebrity. Her exploits were commented upon the world over in chronicles, journals, letters, sermons, treatises, ballads, poems, plays. Myths and legends began rapidly to take shape. Today, there are countless books and articles on Joan of Arc, and she's still in the news. 20 years ago, there were excited reports about a Paris antiques dealer who had found a suit of armor which he believed was Joan's. On what basis? Well, it was very narrow, and it perfectly fit his teenage daughter. Last spring, there were news reports about a ring that was located in England, and which was believed to be the ring that Joan's parents had given her when she was young, and that Bishop Cochon had stolen from her during her imprisonment. Well, the English said that she had given it to him. Give me a break. Anyway, the ring turned up again. This September, there was the theft of a sword from a statue of Joan of Arc in Meridian Park in Washington. And also in September, coincidentally, on the very day that my husband and I were visiting the old marketplace in Rouen, the site of Joan's burning, the New York Times ran an article alarmingly titled, "Joan of Arc's Shaky Pedestal." Well, That article turns out to be about the way history is taught in French schools today, especially schools with large first and second generation immigrant populations. But a subtext is that Joan of Arc has been more or less kidnapped by the racist political right, which considers her its particular patriotic symbol. Why? Well, having saved her nation from English invaders, Joan is viewed by the right as the embodiment of a nationalistic determination to resist immigration and to keep France for the French. Each May, the Front National organizes a rally, and the party leader, currently Marine Le Pen, lays a wreath at the foot of this statue in the Place des Pyramides in Paris. Naturally, that poor Joan has been made into an icon of the right, dismays more moderate factions. Politicians of the center and the left are struggling mightily to reclaim her, periodically organizing competing events of their own. They want to wrestle her from far-right ownership, as an article in The Guardian put it. In any event, this grand equestrian monument, where Marine Le Pen and her followers like to rally, dates from 1874, just after France's humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, when wounded nationalism was turning again to Joan for inspiration. It's one of the more famous among countless representatives of Joan over the years. And I want to show you quickly just a few others. I could have chosen from scores of representations, but I wanted to give you some historical sweep, and I wanted to illustrate some of the uses from the political to the patriotic to the commercial that have been made at Joan. First thing I need to tell you is that all the representatives we have of Joan are imaginary. We don't know a good deal about her. We know that she was slim and dark-haired. We know that she was of medium height, that she was athletic and an abstemious eater. We know that she had a robust constitution that withstood injury, fatigue, and illness. With no more specific information than that, artists have imagined her in various ways over the years, in ways that testify mainly to their own visions or to the requirements of their publics. We have only one image of Joan that was made during her lifetime, and it's this wonderful doodle. It was made by a clerk of the Paris Parliament who was recording the news that had just arrived of the raising of the siege of Orléans, and he made a sketch in the margin. But that clerk had never seen Joan, and he was, to boot, hostile to the cause of the French. The doodle is none too flattering, and he apparently didn't know about her masculine clothing because he has her in a skirt and a scooped neck. He did, however, include the banner that Joan carried that seems to have impressed her contemporaries. Joan said at the trial, this is really interesting, that she loved her banner 40 times better than her sword, and that she never deliberately killed anyone. The next image is from a book called The Life of Famous Women that was published 75 years after her death. Here again is the banner that she loved with its fleur-de-lis and the two archangels whom she admired, Michael and Gabriel, and the words Jesus Maria, which Joan used a great deal. An immediate cause of Joan's execution was, as I've said, her male garb and her boy's haircut. These are integral parts of her story. The cut I've mentioned would have been very short, as I said, above the ears. And the curious thing is that despite this, Joan's often been pictured with long, fair hair. Take, for example, the 17th century Flemish Baroque painting from the workshop of Peter Paul Rubens. Her hair is not just long, but it cascades way down over a plump Rubenesque body all the way down. And it's red to boot. There's something a bit odd about this painting of a kneeling Joan, but I've included it because it is historically very interesting, and you can see it at our own North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh. This wonderful neoclassical painting is in the Louvre, and it shows Joan at one of the grandest moments of her life at the coronation of the king, of Charles, the coronation that she helped to bring about. Here's her banner, of course, and here's the long hair again down to her waist. But what I really like about it is the impracticality of the whole outfit with this skirt that's worn sort of half over and half under the form-fitting wasp-waisted armor. Reproductions don't do justice to the dreamy quality of this beautiful painting, which is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and it's Joan being visited by her saints. It dates from 1879, just after France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. It is, if you get there, in Gallery 800. Jean-Jacques Scherer, an historical painter, created this picture of Joan entering Orléans. Scherer was known for the historical precision, the almost photographic precision of his paintings, and you can certainly see that here. In fact, the inhabitants of Orléans, where she raised the siege by the English, would be forever grateful to Joan. And starting in 1429 and continuing to the present, the day of her victory, which is May 8th, has been marked by festivities and processions. Here's an engraving of which I'm particularly fond. It's from the Figaro Illustré, and it's by a guy named Albert Lynch, a Peruvian painter who had settled in Paris. It's so full of serene self-confidence and Belle Époque optimism. This World War I painting is one of the best-known works of Haskell Coffin, whose pictures were often featured on the covers of magazines such as McCall, Saturday Evening Post, and Red Book. Joan is used here to sell war bonds to Americans. She was also used to sell stain remover. Here's a picture from 1928. It's a 1928 poster that was given to me. And on the upper right, we read, "Down with stains." And at the bottom, "Leaves no rings." Joan's image has been used as well to sell soup and soup spoons and cheese, including goat cheese, brie, and camembert. In fact, if you go to the market, you can still sometimes see Joan of Arc brie, soft, ripened cheese. Joan, of course, is the subject not only of statues and paintings and advertisements, but also of movies. The Victor Fleming film with Ingrid Bergman that I began with, as well as films directed by Carl Theodor Dreyer, Cecil B. DeMille, Otto Preminger, Roberto Rossellini, and Robert Bresson. She's inspired works by Voltaire, Shaw, and Schiller, to name just a few. And of course, she inspired a very unflattering portrait in Shakespeare, Henry VI, Part 1. I can't talk about them all, so I'll just return to the unlikely admirer with whom I began, Mark Twain. In 1896, Twain published the book of which he claimed to be most proud of everything he'd ever written. It was a hefty novel titled Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. It was followed in 1904 by Saint Joan of Arc, the 10-page essay that I mentioned at the start of my remarks this evening, the resounding conclusion of which is this: Joan is easily and by far the most extraordinary person the human race has ever produced. It still strikes me as odd that Twain should have been so smitten with the Maid of Orléans. But Joan's story is shaped by contrasts and tensions. She was a dutiful daughter, but she nonetheless resorted to ruse to defy her parents and escape the family home and get to court. She loved war, but she hated killing, boasting, as I said, that she never killed anyone. She was uneducated, but at her trial, she gave pause to the most learned men of the church. She savored the trappings of religion, by which I mean mass, communion, confession, bells, prayers, ritual of any sort. But she was condemned in arguably the most somber ritual of all, an inquisitorial trial. And she was handed over for burning by the very holy men of the religion she practiced. The same church that condemned her would eventually make her a saint. It took 500 years. Today, Joan of Arc is claimed by Catholics, of course, and also by feminists and gay rights activists, as well as by nationalists, xenophobes, and other right-wingers. Historical events that have marked a culture, if not a civilization, are always rehearsed from time to time to assess their meaning and relevance in terms of an evolving society. But my purpose here tonight is not to reopen the case of Joan of Arc. The records of the trial and the retrial, those two amazing trials, are extensive, and they've been pored over for several centuries. It's unlikely that we'll find anything new lurking there. More to the point, perhaps, is to recognize that there is probably no new insight to be gained into Joan's mind. To me, it's not evident that diagnosing her as anorexic, epileptic, bisexual, or transsexual does very much to advance our understanding. The tools of modern psychology and even of brain science don't really give us a much better comprehension of what Joan saw and heard, or thought she saw and heard, on those days in Domremy that propelled her on that extraordinary course to heady military victory and then defeat and capture. It's also difficult, of course, to enter the mindset of her interrogators, those to whom Joan's voices presented no problem at all, except to figure out where they came from. To all concerned at her trial, it was obvious that Satan is everywhere and that one of the church's gravest responsibilities is to be vigilant and ferret out his demons wherever she can. Those who condemned and burned Joan of Arc were, after all, doing things the way they knew how. Joan interests us today in large measure because she embodied and enunciated an ideal. And insofar as people are still moved to great heroism or great violence in the name of ideals, there is still something here that we can relate to. There's something in the way an untutored girl who knew nothing of history or geography or warfare became a leader of men, respected not just by any men, but by battle-hardened mercenaries, whom, moreover, she forbade to swear or plunder or womanize. There's something in the fearlessness with which she marched across enemy territory to get her king crowned. Something in her unwavering loyalty to that wishy-washy, ungrateful king. Joan's dedication to the ideal of a land under its rightful God-given ruler helped the nation to realize that ideal. No surprise then that in 1944 she was an inspiration to de Gaulle and the very symbol of resistance to the Vichy regime and to the Third Reich. There's a new book out called Paris at War. It's by David Drake, and it tells how during the occupation, somebody in Paris carved "Avenge us!" into a statue of Joan of Arc, and that it took a dozen policemen to hold the crowds back while workers tried to obliterate the slogan. Joan was also a heroine to Winston Churchill, who devotes an entire chapter to her in his 1956 History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Churchill echoes Mark Twain when he writes, "Joan was a being so uplifted from the ordinary run of mankind that she finds no equal in 1,000 years." Is it going too far to say in conclusion, again with Twain, whatever thing men call great, look for it in Joan of Arc, and there you will find it. Thank you very much.